People know fascist states usually by the main examples. You have the Third Reich in Germany under Adolf Hitler and Heinrich Himmler. You have wartime Japan under the Emperor Hirohito. You also have the Italian fascists under Benito Mussolini. And maybe some lesser known but at least famous enough examples, like in Spain you have Francisco Franco, right? Or you have Romania, or basically anything on the Croatia as well, you know. But what the lesser examples are many people will consider quote unquote the most successful fascist states. What do I mean by success? Purely how long they stay in power, or at least a single dictator managed to stay in power for as long as possible. That's that doesn't mean fascism work. Hell no. Although I will argue the United States is the best example of fascism staying in power because I said this more than once. Fascism, if you look in the intellectual ground, has its origins in the United States with the founding fathers. Especially if you read the writings of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Rush, George Washington, and Alexander Hamilton. You know that they laid the seeds of what will be eventually become fascism. The concepts of natural hierarchy and natural aristocracy, the superiority of one race over another, white supremacy and white separatism, eugenics, you know, and the belief in proto-nationalism slash patriotism. You know, if there's nothing outside the state, that you need a state to control. Hell, even 1947, the U.S. Library, Congress, este, even admitted that Alexander Hamilton is considered one of the founding fathers of fascism as we know it. But enough of the United States proper, which is we are living under right now, under the second Trump presidency, which is under currently a Nazi monarchist government in all name, right? But these lesser known examples of fascisms, like for example, you have Brandon Winship, the only dictator in Puerto Rican history, who, although there's not been much written stories about his governorship, but there was some connection here with the Falaganis, which are the Spanish fascists, right? And share many racist similar sentiments, which were very common at the time, sadly, you know. And he committed the Ponce massacre and the Rio Piedra massacre, was appointed by FDR to suppress the independence movement in Puerto Rico. But given that he is the only example of a fascist in Puerto Rico and the only dictator straight up in Puerto Rico, although by far the most successful quote unquote fascist states ever are the more lesser known ones, and some people even disputed if there are even fascists to begin with, right? Originally, I was going to mention the longest reigning fascist dictatorship in history, at least that is consistently considered fascist, is Antonio Salazar in Portugal, who was in power for 36 years, basically around the same time that Francisco Power stayed in power, also 36 years. They were contemporary to one another, they were allies to one another. Although I'm not gonna talk about too much about him because thankfully the Behind the Bastards podcast did an excellent two-part video about his life and his dictatorship and how he put fascism in practice for 36 years. Right? So I'm not gonna focus too much about him. There will links in the description. Now, I gotta focus another example that people debate. The longest reigning fascist dictator and ever, regardless whether or not if they you consider fascist or not, because again, some people debate the definition, would be Chiang Kai-shek in China and later Taiwan. Although he was in power consistently, right? He was in power for 48 years in total. He never controlled all of China. He only controlled basically one fourth of China, right? And over time, keep losing territory until he only controlled Taiwan. To understand that the Shang did attempt fascism in practice between 1927 to 1937. Este, called the Nanjing Decade, you know, but it failed and he abandoned its effort. But he never abandoned completely fascism in its entirety. He considered himself as the Chinese equivalent to Benito Mussolini. Although his type of government, from the beginning, from before he completely went full fascist until after the Nanjing Decade, where he abandoned the fascist approach because it's considered as a non-starter, still maintained many of the fascist principles, right? His government was very oligarchic in style, with alliances with various warlords, large landowners, and a class of capitalists heavily reliant on foreign investment, particularly British and the Americans. Este, he has similar structure where it's not under control, direct government control. He used it to rule and used by military force. You know, reactionary practice such as food binding, polygamy, and child marriage were strictly prohibited because he converted to Methodist Christianity and tried to use like Christian values, but he wanted to incorporate Confucianism. So this is what we call Confucian fascism. And during his regime, especially during the Nanjing Decade, 1927 to 1937, he started the New Life movement to promote Confucianism with traditional Chinese values. He also took for even more rationalist and nationalistic to implement fascist Nazi Germany fascist Italy model. And he actually got training and support by the Nazis and the Italian fascists. He developed the Chinese Blueshirts Society, which was a secret society within the KMT. It was founded in 1932 by Dai Li as an experiment to model the black shirts paramilitary wing of the Italian Fascist Party with a slogan of one doctrine, one party, and one leader, with strong anti-Japanese and anti-Western sentiment and Han supremacist views. Although it was disbanded in 1938, trying to move away the more obvious fascist influence due to the deterioration of the relationship between China and the Axis because of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. But during this time, this is where he betrayed the communists and committed various massacres and purges against any socialists and communists, regardless if they were members of the KMT or outside the party membership. But this doctrine that he presents the New Life movement will later influence Mao Zedong's approach with the three rules of discipline: obedience to order, no confiscation of peasant property, and the prompting to surrender to higher authority of all things taken from landlords, and the 8 points of attention: politeness, honesty, courtesy to women, and so on. In order to make the Chinese soldiers aspire to higher standards, and even under the current fascist dictatorship of China, Xi Jinping using under similar models and inspiration from it. And after his defeat against the communists in China and reaching Taiwan, he later Chiang using anti-communist dictatorship using martial law and the white terror to pursue humanity. But instead of adopting corporatism or crony capitalism, he went to a more traditional Western friendly approach to capitalism, similar to Francisco Franco's Spain, to maintain allies. Even then, even the most left-wing version of the Kuomintang or the left Kuomintang still joined the fascist Japan to develop their own fascist government, despite being what they supposed to be the socialist KMT or the left-wing KMT under the dictatorship of Wang Jingwei. And also, if people forget the KMT, despite under the fascist rule of Chiang Kai-shek during the Nanjing Decade, his government and organization was modeled after Lenin's vanguard party. Again, we see a pattern of many fascist organizations successfully implementing Lenin's vanguard democratic centralist approach, which the Bolsheviks themselves never put in practice during the Bolshevik Revolution, but we do see Mussolini and Hitler trying to use those styles of organization in order to gain their power. Besides that, I'm gonna go back to South America, where the two most ambiguous cases of fascism in practice: Argentina and Brazil. Let's focus about Brazil because it's the most obvious example of fascism between the two. Under the dictatorship of Getúlio Vargas, he copied his model government after Antonio Salazar's Portugal government of Estado Novo. Although he did crush the Brazilian integralists who are the more obvious, like Nazi-inspired groups who crushed them. This is what is considered fascism from above, who are fascists, but they will crush if what is considered the more authentic fascists in order to maintain themselves in power. Japan did like that as well, suppressing the more Italian-inspired or German-inspired fascism in order to maintain their version of fascism in power. Although many scholars agree that Vargas' dictatorship in Brazil it is fascist, although some scholars would consider para-fascism, where there are many elements of fascism without going full-blown fascism. Some people will compare that to Japan and even China to an extent. According to the Cambridge Companion to Fascism to the Far Right, He ruled Brazil as president, quote unquote, in the period between 1930 to 1945 and 1950 to 1954. His political agenda revolved around nationalism, corporatism, and welfareism. Even though he was elected democratically, but established authoritarian state structure. Onlooker had described him various populist, Peronist, and para-fascist. If anything, some people would consider him anti-fascist because he suppressed the Brazilian integrist movement. Although, like I said, there are multiple examples of fascists in power suppressing other fascist party. Japan would be the most biggest example. Or Hitler suppressing the Strauss faction. Or Benito Mussolini suppressing the National Syndicalists. And there's other examples. Given the Vargas copied his model after the fascist government of Portugal called Estado Novo. If you don't know what that is, according to the Cabbage Companion to Fascism at the far right, it is a corporate structure established by Salazar in Portugal in 1934. His title suggests a radicalism, but in reality, the Estado Novo was exactly the opposite: conservative, backward, devoted to modern ambitions, influenced by Charles Murray and the Axis France. It was both the unfascist and anti-fascist, even though Charles Fourier would be considered one of the ideological founders of fascism, right next to George Sorel, right? And if they're trying to suppress the national syndicalists and if they within their movements. This corporate structure established by Vargas as Brazil's president during 1937 to 1945. And during World War II, Vargas developed a peasant movement that is part of his new corporate structure during the war called the Social Democratic Party. And also established the Brazilian Labor Party, an urban movement set up by the dictator for his new corporate structure in the 1930s. Given that Mexico and Brazil were the only Latin American parties, Latin American countries, besides Puerto Rico being forced by constitution by the United States, that they actually participate in the war. So he used this corporate structure to support his own ambitions. Even though they were fighting battle fascists, they were allied to the United States. Vargas' dictatorship of Brazil developed what is called Getúlism, which was inspired by Mussolini's fascism. During Vargas' time as a dictator, he snuffed further at to maintain his control and become prominent in the Brazilian Labor Party. He believed in the creation of a strong centralized state led by a paternalistic figure, whose duty was to morally regenerate society through political reforms up to a whole well-being of the people. And then he used populism to center around his image. He saw the royal state as an institution means to guide the popular towards a virtuous modern society, using its authority to collect interest to achieve general welfare. Under modernist principles, which was considered mainly questionable by more quote unquote traditional fascists. And last but not least, the most weird example of fascism in practice would be Peronism, specifically under the dictatorship of Juan Peron. He was in power in three different occasions. Although many scholars consider his first time as power as the only general fascist one, while the other two examples were more standard Latin American autocratic dictatorships of his time, and to some extent led to even more democratic approach, even though it was completely unnecessary. He was heavily influenced by fascist Mussolini. According to the Oxford Handbook of Fascism and the Cambridge Companion to Fascism at the far right, Peronism is considered an example of fascism from above, similar to Varga, who suppressed the more authentic fascist movement to maintain his power of fascism, similar to Japan, and also an Argentinian form of corporatism. Under Juan Peron, many high official Nazis escaped to Argentina. The most infamous example would be Adolf Hitler, the architect of the Holocaust, or Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, or the Nazi dictator of Croatia, Ante Pavelic. Este, he was also defense minister between 1942 to 1944, where he continued Argentina's army traditional time to Germany to retrain weapons. And after 1946, he was close to Franco. Another infamous Nazi who joined the ranks of Peron, especially his government, was Otto Scorsese. He was Peron's military advisor and his wife's personal bodyguard. Another example would be Ronald Richard, an Austrian-born scientist who spent the war years in Germany. Peron was introduced to Richard through Kurt Tank, a famous German aircraft engineer who designed the Focke-Wulf fighter plane and had recently come to Argentina to develop jet aircrafts. But if the Ronald Richard was a fraud, if the which about his nuclear ambitions. Juan Peron was allied with various fascist dictators like Francisco Franco in Spain, Antonio Salazar in Portugal, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, Alfredo Stroessner in Paraguay, and Rafael Trujillo in Dominican Republic. He also denounced left-wing Peronists in 1973 after they allegedly killed a conservative union leader, Jose Ignacio Duque, who claimed the left-wing Peronists are not part of this movement, and he has his own version of the black church, but according to shirtless. Juan Peron also appointed advisor Jose Lopez Rega, the Argentinian Rasputin, a hardcore fascist occultist who made a fascist death squad called the Argentinian Anti-Communist Alliance, or the AAA, to target leftists, both revolutionary and moderate. And also he has connection with the fascist Masonic group, the P2. Lucio Gelli, the leader of the group, gave him the airplane to return to Argentina from exile, which his arrival resulted in massacre against left-wing Peronists by fascist Peronists. And one of the people involved was a neo-Nazi, Stefano Delle Chiale, member of the Operation Gladio. He also aligned with the Spanish Falanganist fascists. He was more aligned with corporatism and national syndicalism. And remember, 5,000 Nazis escaped to Argentina under his view. And also a great article called What Kind of Populism is Peronism? And I read straight from the quote. Peronism, and mentioned this. Peronism without Peron was to remain a political and electoral machine. Since 1983, has governed the country two-thirds of the time and uninterruptedly in several provinces. True to its fascist and military roots, Peronism now became a true democratic party with open and transparent internal elections. Union leaders and Peronists provisional governors, both of whom behave as semi-feudal lords, split power. From time to time, these oligarchical alliances anoint a charismatic leader to win a presidential election. If successful, the anointed invariably convinces him or herself that he or she will be able to recreate Peron's epic and remain powerful forever. End quote. Throughout the history of Peronism, especially under Peron's lifetime, we see various movements. For example, the Cura Nationalist movement was the fascist paramilitary group and the first guerrilla group in Argentina that joined once Peron's special formation in the 1960s. Originally anti-Peron, but later joined the Peronism. We also have Peron's origin story, which participated in the United Officers Group, a secret military group that Juan Peron was part of, who were either pro-Axis or staying neutral in the war, and participated in the coup that established a fascist dictator, Pedro Pablo Ramirez. We also have the National Liberation Alliance, a Nazi terrorist group that were pro-Nazi that later joined the Orthodox Peronists. And we not forget that Juan Peron published many books, many of them praised fascists, and he actually condemned the Nuremberg trials. Although he's not the only one, Winston Churchill also condemned the Nuremberg trials, saying it's pathetic killing those German soldiers fighting for their country. Again, Churchill was pro-fascist before the war. And I will read the whole article that I think goes into great detail about Peronism and that is fascism. Funny enough, read the biofascist himself, called Peronism is Fascism. Introduction. In the arena of political debate, a common perspective held by many on the left tends to downplay fascism as simply a irrational phenomenon or merely a capitalist reaction to the rise of communism. This perspective aims to diminish the significant role fascism has played in global history. Amid this discourse, Juan Domingo Perón, the former president of Argentina, stands out. As a figure who defies easy categorization, continues to spark intense discussion among both his advocacies and detractors. His complex legacy still wields considerable influence on Argentina's political scene today. Perón's charismatic leadership cut across ideological lines, attracted a broad spectrum of followers, from radical traditionalists to communists and liberals, each eager to claim the label to the true essence of Peronism and interpret his legacy through their own lens. It is somewhat intriguing to see liberals champion Perón as a radical reformer, while communists try to embrace it as one of their revered figures. The historical evidence, however, contradicts these portrayals. Perón was not an ally of communism. He actively suppressed and persecuted communists while he had a chance, and when he returned from exile, the self-identified Peronists were among those who vehemently opposed him, highlighting the contradiction within the movement. Additionally, there are those with the more sophisticated grasp of Peronism who, if they, who argued that Peron's ideology was a watered-down and more palatable form of fascism. However, such a sentiment tend to oversimplify Peron's political philosophy and action, este, which I will aim to elucidate more comprehensively as this discussion is unfold. Peron is fascism. To begin, let's examine a couple of quotes by Peron, provide insight into ideology and views, and these are statements from the man himself. Italian fascism led popular organization to effective participation in national life, which always been denied to the people. Benito Mussolini's rise to power. The nation was on the one hand, the worker on the other, and the latter had no involvement in the former. In Germany happened exactly the same phenomenon, meaning an organized settled for a perfectly ordered community, for a perfectly ordered population as well, a community where the state, if there was the tool of the nation, whose representation was under, in my view, effective, and that this should be the future political form, meaning the true people's democracy, the true social democracy. Mussolini was the greatest man ever century, but he committed certain disastrous errors. I, who had the advantage of this president before me, shall follow his footsteps but also avoid his errors. Traditionalism and Vargas'Regime are the same thing, separate only by space, which is why I am flattered by your Vargas'Regime word that for us sounds like camaraderies. Peron committed to Italian fascism and German organization for integrating workers into the national life, a participation he sees as previously denied, which believes should be the model for the true people's democracy. He also regards Mussolini as a great yet flawed leader, whose mistakes he aims to avoid while following his general path. Lastly, Perrault equates his traditionalism with Vargasism, expresses a sense of kinship, and is pleased by the shared sentiment between the ideologies. Perrault's ideology can be seen as a variant of Italian-style fascism, modified to suit the unique circumstances of Argentina. However, due to Perrault's enigmatic personality and his ideology centered around Perrault himself as a personality, the interpretation of his policies and actions remain debate. Perrault was known for his political adaptability, aligning with groups as diverse as left-wing Monteneros and the right-wing Argentina Anti-Communist Alliance, casting doubt on the consistency of this ideology. Este, his early political influence was shaped by the political movements and labor movements of the 1930s. In Argentina, and his observation of Mussolini's Italy, which he saw as a model for integrating the working class into the nation state, although inspired by Mussolini fascism, Peron aimed to correct its shortcomings and develop judicialism, a doctrine combines social justice and nationalism. He aspired to eliminate class conflict in favor of national unity, echoing themes similar to Italian fascism, distinction between parasite and produce. In the late 1940s, his concept of the third position emerged, positioning judicialism as an alternative to capitalism and communism, which even influenced some Italian fascist factions during the years of lead. Peron's ideology, therefore, appeared to be a personalized variant of fascism, fine-tuned to address Argentina's unique social and political challenges. The phrase social justice may conjure images of certain left-wing views. However, Peron's vision of social justice stands in stark contrast to his contemporary caricature, impressed on the heart and soul of Peronism, embodied by his most noble and compelling attributes, at least according to the fascists. Peron's advocate for a cohesion national community in Argentina, a unity shaped by the principles of Roman Catholic social teachings, ancient Greek philosophy, and Juan Peron's observance of fascism in Italy. Peron believed that the foundation of a strong society lay in two twin pillars of social justice and economic independence, also that the former could not be achieved without the latter. For Peron and other traditionalist theories, economic independence necessitates the nationalization of banks to shield the Argentine economy from external influence. Whether from initiatives like the Marshall Plan, international entities such as International Monetary Fund, or domestic collaborations serving these foreign interests, who he referred to as sepoys. This strategy of nationalization provided Peron with the flexibility he needed to navigate domestic economy policy, despite disruptive efforts of Spanish infiltration. Peron defines social justice as a harmonization of various societal interests, including the reconciliation of labor by capital, moving away from interventionistic concepts of property towards a communal understanding, among other things. This vision of social justice then in stark contrast with the modern day conception of social justice or some conceptions of it, who, according to Peron, thought embodied the most negative aspect of individualism. Their activists, some even conservatives, is rooted in self-centered ideologies and personal fulfillment and expression, and their expression of dissident viewpoints. It is essentially defended against the mechanism of the individual belief which do not tolerate disagreement. In a way, these modern activities exemplify what Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance. Peron's adoption of Mussolini's corporatist model led to the credence of the view that Jewish relativism is a mirror of European fascism. Peron's concept of the corporate state was influenced by the social doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church and Aristotelian view of the state as an entity that is greater than the sum of its parts. This philosophy posits the state, much like an organism, should manage its various components in pursuit of the collective welfare. Society thus manages as one might view the human body, which each part is holding equal importance and working in harmony to ensure the overall health of the system. This idea finds echoes in Christian theology, especially in the writings of Paul in First Corinthians chapter 12, verse 12 to 18, where he describes the church as a body with many parts, and each indispensable to the whole. So, Peron's vision of corporatism took shape through the establishment of national syndicalist economic structure. While he faced temporal limitations that prevented the full realization of his plans, the significant progress was made by 1952 with the formation of 2,000 the agricultural forces, corporate compensation over 750,000 members. These cooperatives enjoy access to state-sponsored credit and priority allocated agricultural equipment. These labor unions underwent transformation of this concept. In Pero's economic framework, entities such as unions today play a pivotal role in shaping Argentina's economic destiny. Control over the means of production was vested in these collective bodies rather than in state hands or individuals. But syndicates members were not just workers but shareholders, but still they had to work with the state and not separate from the state. This model also important the working class or were accustomed to if there was called the shirtless ones, as effectively termed by Evita Peron, providing them with more organic form presentation. Despite these systematic changes, a strong personality emerged about Peron and his first wife. His wife's dedication to less privilege earned her enduring adoration among Argentinians, and they actually petitioned for her the Catholic Church to be a saint. Yet traditionalism is the unique trace in Peron's development of strong personal following followed to distortion his original ideas over time. After Peron was disposed, his wife Isabel Peron assumed leadership, marking the end of an era of authentic Peronist leadership. Despite the transformation of Peronism after Peron, the enduring influence and significant accomplishment is tension marked as a formidable chapter in Latin American history. Under his leadership, a robust sector trade union emerged among various industries, by the state support and encouragement. As a result, the labor movement gained momentum, exemplified by the General Confederation of Labor's readiness to co-strike to secure worker benefit and compliance with labor laws. Although many of the social welfare programs he used were modeled after the Nazi government were trying to appease their own ethnic group as much as possible, so it doesn't encourage resistance and trying to appease them as much as possible to satisfy the workers. And they also place significance on the Roman Catholic religion in shaping the Argentinian nation's future. To the extent that 1949 Peronist constitution required all presidents to be Roman Catholic. Juan Peron's political ideology was deeply influenced by Catholic social teachings, particularly in the encyclical Rerum Novarum, which promotes the concept of class cooperation, which this is the foundation of corporatism. With the fascist corporatism Peron, Antonio Salazar in Portugal, or Vargas in Brazil adopt. While Peron faced criticism when his later treatment of the Roman Catholic Church, which contributed to the coup that ousted him in 1955, it's noteworthy that Peron recognized his error, confronted the church, and even offered to resign to placate them. Antonio Plaza, the Archbishop of La Plata, suggests that Peron was coerced by Masonic influence into opposing the church, which is natural. Nonetheless, the antagonism was also fueled by Catholic laypeople who formed the Christian Democratic Party in 1954 with the aim of supplanting Peronism, prompting Peron to act to defend the Peronist state, and would take efficacy as either self-serving or acting in national interest. This period strains Peron's relationship with the Church, which has previously supported his movement. The Church backing of his 1955 coup led to his 18-year exile, and there is debate over Peron's excommunication. While decrees was issued for excommunication of those responsible for the expulsion of Bishop Dado, it didn't specify individuals. Pedro Banderin argued that according to canon law, only the Pope could excommunicate a head of the state, and Peron did not receive such a decree by Pope Pius the 12th. Nevertheless, Peron sought to reconcile the right to Pope John to express his contribution to he was indeed excommunicated. Before this event, his wife was granted an audience with Pope Pius during her European tour and accounted that highlight the church's initial endorsement of the Perons. The Pope gifted her a rosary, and Peru received a papal declaration following day, suddenly Vatican's recognition of their leadership. And again, the Catholic Church supporting a fascist, which is not new. Look at Portugal, look at Brazil, look at Spain, hell, even look at Italy. Despite Pero's occasional anti-clerical stance and his intolerance for dissidents, the influence of the Roman Catholicism and the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas remained significant to his governments. When faced with potential abdication over his treatment of the church, Peron resign was ultimately refused by the Partido Justicialismo and the CCG, who demonstrated that he resigned his offer to step down, reflecting the complexity of his relationship with religious authority and his political party support. The notion of democracy presented potential risk to the stability of the Peronist state in Argentina. Despite that, Peron confidently allowed for democratic election, and his faith in the electoralism was rewarded when securing his second term with a commanding 60% majority. However, some may argue that was unnecessary gamble to expose the state to democratic processes, especially since Peron had already considered power in his own hands. His decision to process this election revealed a complex interplay between his desire for popular legitimacy and the inherent risks involved. The issue of to deal with traitor is another matter highlighting the fundamental different perspectives. Following the failed coup attempt in 1951 led by General Benjamin Menendez, there was a call for the execution of those involved. Peron, however, chose a path of nonviolence, famously stated that he would not allow his hands to be stained with the blood of another. This stance reflects a more ethical judgment, but this is a response to Benito Mussolini's execution of high-ranking generals who did try to do a coup d'etat, tried not to repeat the same mistake. So his rejection of capital punishment is a lesson from other previous fascists before him. His attempt to avoid a pitfall of Mussolini, who could have prevented similar downfall. In 1955, with U.S. backing reactionary forces to dispose him, led to his exile to a brief return to power in 1973 before his death. In this examination, Juan Peron is covered was a notable example of fascism with a very weird characteristics back and back, very contradictory and very flawed because judged by the actions of Juan Peron himself. And these are what I consider the quote unquote most successful fascist states ever put in practice. It just leads to death, oppression, and persecution of everybody because they want to take control all to themselves. If you want real liberation, it's not the state. That's all I have to